Having said that, I'm thrilled that we have Gordon Quinn with us here, who is one of the founders of Cartemquin Films. Cartemquin Films is one of the producers of the film as well. Gordon has been making films for 50 years. Do I have that right?
50-some.
50-some years. The list of films that he has been a part of as a filmmaker himself, a cinematographer, an editor, and executive producer goes on and on. I'll mention some of them here, including Hoop Dreams, Vietnam, Long Time Coming, Golub, Five Girls, Refrigerator Mothers, and Stevie, Life Itself, The Home Stretch, On Beauty, Almost There, In the Game, and most recently, the What's on Stars, which is America to Me. You're one of the executive producers on that as well. The other thing I just want to mention, he's won numerous awards, but one that I always like to mention is that in 2016 he received the SimFest 4th Annual Badass Award, and I think that's really appropriate, right, for the screening. And as Dana Cupper always likes to say, it's nice to start these with a story. So I thought we'd get Gordon to tell us one of his skateboarding stories, right?
Yeah, right.
Okay, I guess not.
My skateboarding stories, I never got on one.
Okay.
That's why I have all my limbs and everything.
Yes. So
you forgot.
What did I forget? Already?
The last Pullman car, which you worked on.
Actually, I'm so happy that you brought that up, because when I bring the last Pullman car up to people, they go, you need to take that off your bio. It's like you did that a long time ago. But that is a story I'd be happy to share. That's the first film I worked on at Cartemquin Films. I was a commercial editor, and they were looking for an assistant editor on a documentary. And at that time, I didn't even know really what a documentary was, but I knew that I wanted to do something other than what I was doing. And so I said, yeah, of course, I know how to edit documentaries. And I got to meet Gordon and Jerry Blumenthal and work with them on the last Pullman car. And really that was the beginning of over 15 years of ongoing films that we have worked on together, and an ongoing relationship with Cartemquin Films. So thank you for bringing that up. So Gordon is here. We're going to talk a little bit about Cartemquin's relationship to this film and Cartemquin's relationship to filmmakers in general, especially young filmmakers. So as we were talking before, part of what we're excited about here at DePaul, especially in the documentary program, is all of the filmmakers that we see who are really getting excited about stories that they want to tell, techniques, camera techniques, all sorts of things that are really exciting and sort of feel like the future. There's a lot about this film that really mirrors that. So I would love it if you could just talk a little bit about Cartemquin's relationship both to young filmmakers and to this film in particular.
Well, the organization is over 50 years old, and as we have evolved, we've been through many different organizations. We were a little company with 3 guys. In the late 60s and 70s, we were a collective of maybe 13 people. We've now transformed ourselves once again into a media arts organization. And one of our real mission is to develop the next generation of independent filmmakers, of independent documentary makers, people who have an idea, they want to make a film. It's maybe not something that's that commercial, but something that they have a vision for it and a story that they want to tell. And Minding the Gap is just a terrific example of that. It turns out, someone told me how, Bing, I think, told me how I first met him, but now I forgot. I always thought it was through the union, because he was in the union and I'm in the same union, and he was working as a camera assistant in the union. But he came into our Diverse Voices in Docs program, which is for people of color. It's a 6-month program, 1 Saturday a month, so that working people can come and that kind of thing. And we do it on the South Side. And Bing was developing this project called Minding the Gap. He had a title, but he was making a completely different film. It was a survey film about young men who skateboard and their troubled relationships with their fathers. And he was doing it all over the country. He shot, I think, in Houston and other cities. And it was going to be kind of this survey of how so many of these young men have difficult family relationships. And through DVID, it sort of evolved into, it was going to be more about where he came from, Rockford, where he grew up, and his friends. It was going to be about his friends. And I think then after David, and you kind of see it in the movie, you see that moment when he's talking with Keire, and about, Keire says they call it child abuse now, and Bing says, did you cry? And Keire says, I think everybody cries. Didn't you? And Bing says, yeah, I cried. And it was like, oh, what's that about? And then little by little, Bing, and when I read his early descriptions of what the film was about, he refers to something like the monster. He says there's the monster, but he's not saying what it is. And finally, at that point, it became clear that he had to be in his own movie and was going to be a character.
So that scene that you bring up, I mean, it's such a pivotal scene in the movie, and it does really feel like, because the way the film opens with all the skateboarding footage, it's really exciting, it's really fun, it's great. You're like, yeah, all right, and then you have that moment, and you realize, oh, there's a lot more that's going to happen here than just the skateboarding.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of curious, at what point did that interview sort of happen in the process, and how were you involved with sort of saying this is something to include in the film or not include in the film?
It was I was looking at the cut with him, and I think Diane, the producer, if I remember correctly, and it was like he had already put that scene in there, but it was like, oh, there's more, behind that scene. And so we talked about that a little bit. But because his early cut of the film was kind of about him. It was about Zack and Keire and Nina, and some of his other friends played, a role in it, but it was very much about being in Rockford. So it had changed already from this survey film to something that was going to be more like a character-driven thing about these particular people in a particular place.
And beyond just particular people in a particular place, his friends.
Yeah.
And then ultimately him. So this is one of those films where it's a very personal story, and I'm guessing that his involvement in the story, I mean, even in that little scene, you hear the beginning of him sort of connecting with, I'm a part of this story too. This is about me as well. But I'm guessing it took a while for him to really sort of decide he was going to be a part of the film. Can you talk a little bit about how that process went?
I think he struggled with it. It took a while for him to come to terms with the fact that he was going to have to become a major character, and then eventually he realized he's going to have to try and talk to his mother, which was a big bridge to cross. But I think once he sort of started down that path, there was no turning back. I don't think he ever had doubts about that. I've worked with other filmmakers where it's a very personal film, where it has gotten so heavy that they have been like, can I turn around here? Can I get out of this? I mean, Stevie is an example where there were times when Steve was just like, I don't think we should be making this movie. He wanted to give up. And so it's complicated when it's that personal. The thing that I think is, for me, really lands in Minding the Gap is that Bing is in his movie because he belongs in his movie, because their story is his story, and he couldn't tell it without risking and revealing something about himself. I think sometimes I see films where I feel it's a little bit self-indulgent, where you sort of feel like the filmmaker is more interested in themselves and telling you about them than the people who are around them, who sometimes are more interesting. And so it's a complicated thing to get right, and I think being difficult as it was, and as much of a journey as it was, he got it right.
I would totally agree with you, and I believe this idea of it being a fine line between sort of needing to be a part of the film and then becoming self-indulgent. How do you help a filmmaker sort of navigate the back and forth of that? Like you said, I'm guessing it's a lot of conversations. Like you said, you had conversations with Steve about Stevie, but what kind of conversations were you having around this issue with Minding the Gap?
It's conversations and asking questions. And for me, one of the most important things is really paying attention to what the filmmaker is trying to do and the story that they're trying to tell. And I knew in some conversations with Bing, I could sort of tell there was just something he wasn't laying on the table. I was like, there was something missing that he was very passionate about. I think, so that's the starting point. It's like, well, what is this person trying to do, and how can I help them get to where they're trying to get? And you were describing it earlier when we were talking, that early on in a film, there's often that point where you've done some shooting and you've found your characters almost, and you have no idea where you're going or where the story's going or what it's actually about, and it can be very confusing. And I think sometimes I've seen films that kind of, got too uncomfortable with that confusion, and so they give something, rather than struggling through to get to what the material is really about and what the story really is, they kind of go for an easier way out, and it's never as strong a film. I mean, Bing spent 5 years on this. He was like, he wanted to get to where he was going.
And, I'm glad you brought that up, because a lot of times when I'm working on films and I'll be telling people, they'll say, what are you working on? And I'll tell them, and they're like, you were working on that 3 years ago. I think sometimes it's hard to understand the length of time that is often needed, especially when you are, like you said, you want to try and get it right. You want to really get to that place in the story where it feels true. And that can be a challenging process as well. But talk a little bit about the value of that, because I think especially in this day and age, we think that we have to get things done very quickly. We have to say things very quickly. I always feel like that time spent adds up to something. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
I mean, it is, I can put it in the crassest of commercial terms. I'm often, being challenged by a broadcaster or funder who is saying, well, why do you have so much in the budget for editing? Other people do it in half the time. I'm like, yeah, but that's why our films are so good. It's that simple,
right.
On one level. And I think, the reason I'm so passionate about documentary is because I think that they really have a role to play in our democracy, and a role to play in helping people to understand each other. So take Minding the Gap. It deals with domestic violence. There are a lot of films that deal with domestic violence where men are not present. They're just some bad thing out there. Bing has created a film in which he's not letting his characters off the hook, or maybe you think he does, but basically you also feel for them and care about them. And I think that's a much harder thing to find the balance to. It's a much harder thing to get to that complicated, nuanced story where you understand that these are people that have good in them, they have bad in them, and how do you tell that really complicated story, which ultimately is what's going to help you understand someone and help you to intervene in a way or do something that could actually make a difference.
I actually appreciate that you said that, because I think when I finish the film, I feel a lot of compassion for everybody. And I don't feel like I had to take sides, and I didn't have to judge the absent abusive father versus the son who was sort of the victim of that. I felt like I could see everybody together really sort of grappling with this and struggling with this. And so I think that I would agree, one of the triumphs I think of the film is that you're left with a very complex feeling about everyone, right? And even including Zack.
Yeah, absolutely.
Who could be, for me, he could have been painted in a much more narrow light. Yeah. Right? But I think it speaks to...
Yeah, and it is, it's a core Cartempuan value, I think. We don't do exposés. I love them. I think they're important and they're good. Fan of Michael Moore's, not all his films, but he's made some really great films. But that's not what we do. And I learned this many years ago from Ricky Leacock, actually, I can't remember what we were talking about at some festival or something, and he was giving me some advice about, I don't even remember the context, but he says, don't make films about people you can't like. And that's been there. I mean, we've made some films where we have a film about a guy who went to prison for child molesting, you know? And it's not like we don't want to hold our characters accountable, but we want to care about them. We want to, you know, we're not there to just skewer them or throw them under the bus. You know, if I did a film about McNamara or Rumsfeld, that's what I would do, but I don't make those films.
Right. I really appreciate you saying that, because I think it's not about every character being likable necessarily, but it's, you have to have some kind of compassion or some kind of connection.
Yeah.
Right. You don't want to just be exploiting these people, right, for your own gain as a filmmaker.
Or for spectacle.
Or for spectacle, yeah. And so that brings up another idea, which is, because this is such a personal film, and yes, Bing did reveal some things about himself that were clearly very personal, but he also revealed some things about his friends that were very personal. And I was struck when Nina said to him, please don't bring this up to Zack. I don't want you to rock this relationship.
Right.
And yet it's all in the film. So at some point it's obviously all been brought up to Zack.
Right.
So talk about how that was navigated.
Well, certainly at the time when she asks him, he doesn't bring it up to Zack.
Right.
You know, it's later in the course of it. But one of the things that we did, you know, to give you an idea of what a complicated process this is, of course, the people in the movie see it first, and that's a Cartemquin, you know. Again,
it's what you always do.
Yeah, it's and not everybody does this, but basically Bing said to his characters what we say to our characters, which is, you're going to see it, and you know, I'll still be able to make changes. You know, if you can't live with something, I will take it out.
So you offer that
with everyday people. We offer it with people like the people in Bing's film. When I did a film about Bill T. Jones, the dancer who has his own dance troupe, he's one of the most important dance companies in the U.S. He's a famous person. I don't say that. I reverse it. You know, I say, look, you're going to see it. We still show it to him before anybody else sees it, and we're going to listen to you if there's something that you're really upset about or think is wrong, but at the end of the day, it's our decision.
Okay. I'm really glad you made that distinction, because I think that is a tricky thing that every filmmaker has to figure out at the end of the film. It's like, what's the film that they want to live with? What's the relationship they want to have to the people that are in the film as the film goes forward? And that's also what I wanted to ask you about. How are Bing's relationships with his friends that were in the film now, and how's their relationship to the film right now? So there's a couple of relationships that start happening.
It's really important question, and you know, Maggie Bowman helped us with this, and then Diane. When we were getting ready to go to Sundance, we talked to all the major characters about coming to Sundance. Did they want to come? Did they not want to come? Including Bing's mother. They had all seen the film. They were all pretty fine with it, you know. But we knew coming to Sundance, all of a sudden you're on a stage and people are writing about you in the press, and you know, and so we did a lot of work to prepare people for that, and to also make it clear to them that, look, we're inviting you, but you don't have to come. If you don't, you know, it's your decision, and we're happy to support you in a sense, with whatever
your relationship to the film
and
is.
Ultimately, Nina didn't come. And I think partly because it was still difficult for her to be around Zack.
Yeah.
Was part of why she made that decision. But there have been other screenings where there have been some screenings where they're all there together. There have been some screenings where she's there and he's not. But they've been coming to screenings. They've been, you know, and that's particularly with a film like this, it's terribly important to build that relationship with your subjects, and then make the world out there, and particularly the press, understand this movie got made because all of these people were brave. So an incredible moment for me was at Sundance. It's the premiere of the film, and everyone's up on stage. Bing's mother is there, and she was like, up until the last minute, she was like, no, I'm here, but I don't want to go on stage. You know, she was going back and forth, and finally she comes up, and she's on the stage too, and they're just all there, and there's like a Q&A going on, and applause and everything, but the applause then is for everybody that's on the stage, and that's the message that we want to put out there to the press, in a sense. Don't go after our characters, because we all took risks to make this film. I mean, you can be critical of our characters, but don't take a cheap shot. Don't, write one of those articles that throws somebody under the bus, that kind of thing. And there was this incredible moment. Bing was over here and his mother's over here, and it was like in the middle of the queue, something had come up, and he walks across the stage and gives his mother a hug. Oh. So it was just, but that's, Aww. We think about that, and we spent a lot of time with particularly Bing and Diane and Maggie also, to make sure that people were prepared and that we weren't, just taking people into the spotlight.
Well, that's what
unprepared.
That's what I wanted to say, because when you're making a film, you're in the editing room, or it's your friend showing up with a camera, or can I come and interview you again? And it has a very intimate sort of feel to it. It feels like it's just the three of you or the four of you making this film. And then all of a sudden, it's out of the editing room, and it's being screened, and there's all these people that are watching it and commenting on you, as this person in the film. And that's just such a shift from, but both are necessary, right? You need people to see films. You need people to see your films. So
it's got to go out into the world, but it is a tricky business. I mean, I think the underlying principle that I like to say to people and get people to understand is, as a filmmaker, you have power. And as soon as you have the camera in your hand, you have a certain kind of power that maybe your subjects don't in relationship to what you're involved in. And you have to pay attention to those power relationships. When we were talking earlier about, a famous person, I say ultimately it's our decision. An everyday person who has less power, it's like, I have to give them that power. We have to, it doesn't level the playing field completely, but it helps. And so, I mean, I've told the story before of the moment in Home for Life, my first film. I'm filming a scene with an old lady and her son and daughter-in-law putting away her laundry. And it's a brutal scene. It's 8 minutes of screen time. And all that's being talked about is laundry. And they seem to be treating her terribly. It's just a very uncomfortable scene. But what actually happened was, in the middle of the scene, the old confused woman turns to the 23-year-old cameraman and says, I don't want to be in the movie anymore. It's too much. It's too hard. And the camera goes off. This is double system, so the tape recorder kept going. And you hear this 23-year-old kid explaining to this woman how her being in the movie is going to help other people. She's having a hard time adjusting to the home, but it's really good for everybody, and blah, 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 blah. And finally she's like, okay, I'll be in the movie. And the camera goes back on, and everything proceeds as if nothing had happened. And the point of that story is, at 23, I was like, great, I got it.
Right.
And I went and I called Temner. He didn't have to be there on that shoot. We got it. We got the scene because we knew how important this scene was. Because it was about guilt and how people sometimes because they feel badly, they treat people guiltily. And it was just pure verité, all of that coming through. And at 23, I didn't really take responsibility for what I'd done. I didn't know what I had done. I had all the power. She probably thought I worked for the home, and she had none. And so once I understood that, it was like, okay, you always have to pay attention to that. And that, people sometimes think, oh, well, why are you bringing this up? It's making everything so difficult. The truth of the matter is, one of the reasons that we, in our 50 years of filmmaking, we've had so little trouble with our subjects and with our, is because we're always sensitive to that. We're paying attention to it and getting to it before it comes up in some very awkward situation in a way that it shouldn't.
One of the things that we say here when we're talking to our students is that it's a privilege. It actually is a privilege that someone is letting you into their life, and you can't really let go of that. It doesn't mean that you don't get to push like you did. I mean, as a 23-year-old, maybe you weren't even fully thinking through what you did, but you actually hung in there for the film as well.
And that is something as a filmmaker you have to do too, right? You don't want to just every time someone gives you a little pushback, go, all right, I guess I'm done.
No.
Right?
You just have to take responsibility.
Yes,
for
and
pushing.
that's what I wanted to get at, which is that it isn't about all or none,
not.
But it's about if you decide to push through, or you put scenes in your film, or you decide to follow a character to a point where they've expressed something that's very upsetting, you've got to take responsibility for it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
No, in Vietnam, Long Time Coming, and in many of our films, actually, I have a whole set of clips that I show which address exactly that question. What do you do when somebody asks you to stop filming? And, I've done different things in different situations, and we have some clips where somebody basically says, I'm done. He's saying it to Peter. He's saying, I'm done. I don't have any more. A very upset veteran who's, finally broken down and teared up. Very controlled guy. And Peter keeps filming. And what comes out in that additional minute is incredibly moving and incredibly powerful. And the guy who's in it is fine with it.
Right.
In retrospect.
Right.
But he did ask him to stop filming.
But that is one of those, it gets at the relationship that you're building
Absolutely.
and developing and being aware of. I just wanted to talk a little bit about, and we were talking a little bit about intent and ethics, and this goes along the same thing, because I think it's not what you're thinking about when you start filming. But at some point, if your film becomes good, the power comes from those places where there is that tension. And so how do you navigate that a little bit in terms of making those choices to either keep things in or take them out? I'm guessing those are some of the bigger discussions, right? What stays in, what goes?
What stays in and what goes. I mean, two things. One, for me, when you first start thinking about a film, the ethical questions are there. One of the things that I often ask people who want to make a film, particularly people who want to do something cross-culturally or about something that is not their world but some other world, and I'll say, what do you think gives you the right to tell these people's story? And it's not like there's a right answer to that. I just want to make sure that they have thought about it and wrestled with it, because if they haven't, they're not ready to make the film. So it really starts very early on. Then when you get into the editing room, you're really talking about the nitty-gritty of editing. How do you, and there, I was telling Suzanne, there's a whole couple of characters who came out of Minding the Gap. They were in there for a long time. It was only when Bing started to work with another editor, a much younger editor than me, that this father and son, you see the little boy in the scene who, when they have the contest inside in Zack's skate park, and Zack gives him a boot. He wins I forgot what it was called, but the something award, to this like 12-year-old kid. And actually his father is in the film. And it's a very different kind of family from the ones that are portrayed, and it's a family in which there really isn't violence. And so it was a wonderful contrast to the other characters, and I thought added a lot to the film. But ultimately, to make the film really work, they took it out. The other thing that when Bing started to work with Josh, and they got much younger editor, much more in tune with kind of what skateboarders look at. And I said to Suzanne, the film got 20 years younger, because all kinds of things are cut up and don't play out, where my taste is to let something kind of play out. But when it was, it was like, yeah, you guys are on the right track. This is great, And the film has a lot more energy and a lot more intercutting than it did when,
Well, and you bring up something interesting there, because I think every filmmaker is going to make the film the way they want to make it, which is not to say that there aren't some things that are sort of right or wrong, but there's a lot of things that become sort of your decision, your voice, your way that you want to say it. So how do you walk with those two ideas, like the filmmaker's voice, the filmmaker's visual choice, whatever it is, and then those Cartemquin rules or ideas that have been around,
right,
that really still hold a lot of weight. So how do you balance those two things?
Well, it's it's starting first to understand what that voice is. Here's an example of something where, and I just had met with these people yesterday, and I guess they had been talking with Jeff Spitz,
okay.
And they were saying, they were talking about this problem of everybody giving you advice, and it's really a matter of trying to figure out what to listen to and what to throw away, which is, I think, something that filmmakers need to learn. How do you take in advice? You can't do everything that everybody says, and sometimes you're getting bad advice. And then they were talking to Jeff, and and they were telling me this story, and they said, "Of course, unless Gordon Quinn says it, and then you should do it." But one of the things that
which is sort of true, Gordon.
One of the things that I had told them, and this is where I'm trying to dig into this a little bit, because I look at their cut, and it's like they've really got a good film there, but they have all of this voiceover over, kind of B-roll or people doing other things, and I said, where is the person? Can't I see them? I know you have the interview. Can't I see them on camera? Can't I see their face and their gestures and their, I'm not saying don't use a lot of voiceover, but you never let me see them and connect with them as a human being. And what they said was, we didn't want to have a talking heads film. Now, that's not the filmmaker's voice. That's a voice in their head that's come from we shouldn't have talking heads. And, of course, my mantra is, if the head is saying something and it makes you feel something, that's not a talking head. That's movie making. Right. I've got whole films that are nothing but people talking, Taylor Chain. It's just labor negotiations going on, and it's very dramatic. So that, now they wove it the way you see it all through our films. But that's one kind of thing. It's like understanding that, no, this is really the filmmaker's voice. This is what they're trying to break through to. And these are these other things that they've picked up along the way, which is that voice in your head that you should be ignoring.
Or I'm supposed to do it like this.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
and it's
exactly.
like, no, you're not.
Yeah.
But it is interesting when you watch something and you're not quite sure why they're doing it, and they say, because, and they give you the reason, because I didn't want any talking heads. It's like, no, so you don't take everything out, right? It's just funny how I appreciate that.
No, and it's always, you want to do things because they're helping you to tell the story and communicate what it is that you're trying to get at about the complexities of people and who they are. And, it's like Kartemquin. People will look at our films and they'll say, that's a Kartemquin film. But we don't have any rules in the sense that there aren't any genres. There isn't a genre of, we have films that are very verité. We have films that have a narration. We have films that they're very different in some ways. We don't keep making the same film, and then the filmmakers bring their own sensibilities to it, and yet there are some common underlying themes where you can say, okay, I get it.
Yeah, I would say having the big picture or the big ideas be so embedded in the story that they're there and you're hearing them and you're learning them, but you're hearing them through story, and then at the end you're like, that was about spousal abuse, and I didn't even, I was learning it in the context of story, not through some sort of narrated kind of different sort of approach. So it looks like we're going to Q&A at this point. That went kind of fast. Do we have people that are interested in asking Gordon questions? Anybody? I think you have to walk over to do they have to walk over to the camera? Everybody knows the drill, right? There's the microphone there. Anybody want to ask Gordon a question? About anything. He'll answer anything. I'm sorry?
So I have to go.
Yeah, you do, sorry. I have a question while we're waiting for him. I know there's this moment where we have to wait until he walks over, but how did he come up with the title of the film? Because titles of films are tricky, right?
Yes, and he has answered that question, and I forgot what he says.
So
what
we'll
I
ask
do
him
know, we ask him tomorrow. What I do know is he had the title when he came to DVID. He already
That's
had
what you
the
said,
title.
yeah. Okay.
He had it right at the beginning. And another film where the filmmakers had the title when they came into Cartemquin was Hoop Dreams. And that was another situation where the original vision for that film was going to be a short about kids who play street basketball, and they had this shooting, they had done some stuff on a court and stuff, and none of those people are in the film.
I remember that trailer.
Yeah.
And I have the T-shirt for the after-school special, which is what it was originally going to be.
Going to be something, yeah. But they had that title, Hoop Dreams, and it's a great
Seemed to
title.
work.
Yeah.
Okay, so
I made it over here now.
yes, thank you.
So in the case of like a subject being uncomfortable with what's on screen, like let's say that you showed this film to Zack and he says, well, this paints me in such a poor light, like this will ruin, any job potential or like, any future relationships I could have. Like, what do you do in the case that they're like, I don't want this out there after you've been with them for so long and you have this narrative and they're like the crux of the film, but then they ask to be taken out after they see it. Has that ever happened, or?
It has. It's a risky thing to put on the table because when you give up some of your power and let your subjects have power, it's a big risk. In Minding the Gap, I think by and large that Zack was willing to be. The first time he saw the film, it was like very upsetting to him emotionally. He was just, oh my God, that's me.
Right.
And I think that's the other thing. One thing that can be really tricky is that you've made a very complicated and honest film, and people will look at it and they'll say, that is me. I know. I went with Maria Finitzu once. We were going to show it to one of the families in 5 Girls, and the young girl and her mother have this really painful scene in a bookstore, and everyone kind of comes off badly. And Maria was really like, oh my God, what's going to happen when they see that scene? And it was like, they were fine with it. They laughed about it. They almost, sometimes we find when we show the films to people, almost things are repeated. But we have at times taken things out of the film. God, I had an idea and now I forgot an example of a story. But one thing that sometimes too, there's a journalistic problem. And so in Minding the Gap, when Zack is talking about the guy that he had the skate park with, and then he disappeared and he stole his money and this and that. And there was a journalistic problem with how we had that in there originally, which was that it was hearsay. And we eventually took a little bit of it out, and felt, no, this isn't quite right. But I had an example of something else where what someone is concerned about. Well, actually, in Home for Life, my first film, I remember an example. The same family with the laundry scene. It's the last scene in the film, and we're getting ready to film it, and they're going to have the big meeting with the social worker about how things are going, and that it's the mother, the father, and the young boy. And this is a big scene for us. We're pretty sure it is going to be the end of the movie. We didn't know for sure. And just before we go in to shoot it, the family says, oh, we don't want you to film this. We're going to talk about private stuff. And, we filmed all of this incredibly intimate stuff with them up till now. And finally we asked, well, what do you mean by private? And they said, oh, we're going to talk about money and our financial relationship with the home. And we were like, oh, no problem. We won't be, we'll walk out when you talk about that. And usually the things that we've taken out or that we haven't used make sense either in an ethical way or in a way. Sometimes people, in The New Americans, I was filming with the Palestinian woman, and it was the day of 9/11. And she's making coffee, and she's had some incidents at work. People have said things to her. And she's very upset and very, and she says some very harsh things about America. And right at the scene, right in that scene, she turns to me and she says, I don't want that in the movie. She sees that I'm filming. And in that particular case, I could say to her right at that moment, Nirma, I know what you're feeling and I know what you mean, but I won't use it in the movie because you're right. An American audience could not hear those things from you. they'd misunderstand it, and they would.
Right.
And so we
Right.
never used it.
Right. Was there anything in Minding the Gap that had to be taken out, aside from this, like you said, the skateboard building?
Or
had to, or decided to?
I don't think so. I think that we do. There are sometimes you realize there are things that we could have been a little more nuanced about. So whether Zack actually suffered any physical abuse, he says contradictory things about that, and they're both in the movie. But the press picked up on some of that in ways that were unfortunate, because probably he didn't. It was more verbal and mental abuse.
Right.
So, but it's a tricky situation, and one of the things that we have a lot of confidence in is that we have built the right relationship with our subjects, and we've treated them in a way. A lot of times, if you show people's contradictions, it's fine. What causes the problem often is not what they felt seeing the movie, it's what somebody said to them, some relative or some other person or the press, and that has caused
triggers some.
Yeah, well, it caused because they're like, oh, people are seeing me this way. No, they're actually not. They're seeing you as a complicated human being that you are, but people trying to protect other people has caused us issues.
We have another question.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Akram Shibli. I'm a screenwriting student, but I was so blown away by the storytelling here. It was incredible. And you talked about the fine line a little bit between telling a personal story and, something that other people can access and not feel like the filmmaker is self-indulgent. And I was wondering if you have any advice for filmmakers who are kind of making a personal documentary, but are using that to access some bigger ideas, and how to walk that line, if there's any practical tips you might have.
What is your film about?
It's about, I'm Syrian, and I'm doing a film about Syrian refugees, but also comparing it to my family's immigration story.
So, one of the things that I kind of said it earlier, it's like a lot of times I've been involved in projects where the filmmaker is drawn into their own film. But I think, is your family refugees, or were they?
They're not. They're regular immigrants, so I thought it would be an interesting comparison to make.
So one of the ways that I think you can think about that is, how am I going to tell this story that also creates some of my anxiety, and that you're risking something too, in other words, you want to tell a story about refugees, but your family story isn't a refugee story, and yet that they resonate with each other. And as you go down that road, maybe let some of your doubts or those contradictions come into it. That's maybe not very articulate, but I think that might be a place to look. One of the ways that we sometimes have found a solution to kind of who's telling this story and where do they come from is by trying to be more transparent rather than less, and more transparent about some of our anxieties. So when I talked about Steve's role in Stevie and his doubts and his feeling that he couldn't go on making this movie, we filmed some of that and we put it in the movie, so that the audience can understand what the filmmaker is going through. One of the things that happened after Stevie came out is people would look at the film and they say, boy, that's Steve James' character. We don't like him, and we feel he's exploiting that young man and, to make himself famous and that kind of thing. And we're like, yeah, we're aware of that. We put it in the movie so you could see it. And we took the risk of putting some of those unflattering things about Steve out there so that people, not everyone, but some people, come to a very negative conclusion about him.
And you actually, I'm just going to jump here. I think when you're watching something that feels self-indulgent, I think it's because you haven't taken that risk to reveal more. And that's what Gordon, I think, is talking about in terms of transparency, that you really controlled your side of the story. That's when it starts to feel like, well, wait a minute. all of these people that you've filmed with have revealed and been very vulnerable, and yet your story seems so polished and controlled and without sort of the contradictions, as you're calling it. So I think that's what you're getting at, right?
Yeah.
That you just making sure that it's the same level of risk for everyone if you're going to be a part of it.
Yeah,
so
or
that
at
you
least
don't
some
get
risk.
to,
Yeah.
to some degree, that you don't get to be over here and sort of, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And let everybody else sort of feel that they're struggling a little bit with what they're revealing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's a funny thing, though. I mean, I think that, you know, being Syrian, that gives you a connection to your subjects and the refugees that you want to tell the story about. And if you tell your own family's story, you know, the resonances and the similarities can be as important or relevant as the differences.
No, it's
You know.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Do we have more questions?
Hey, how's it going? My name is Samuel Wolford. I'm an MFA directing student. Quick question, kind of going off of what Akram had just asked. More specifically, do you believe it's possible for a director to honestly tell his own story?
It depends what you mean by honesty. You know, there is this thing that, and Werner Herzog looks to babble on about cinema verité, and it's ridiculous. There is no such thing as, you know, objective truth, and it's like, whoever said it was, you know, we never claim that. But I think, I think it is possible for people to tell their own story. Just don't get fooled into thinking that it's the truth in that sense. It's a story from a point of view, from a perspective, and, you know, from your perspective. And there have been some very good films. Well, Bing is telling his own story
I think
here.
Bing's is a good example.
You know, he came to it reluctantly, but it is, you know, what drew him to this subject and what drew him to this theme of abuse was his own story. So, yeah, I think it's very possible. But the trick, and Suzanne used the perfect word, it's you want to always be careful not to be like self-indulgent. You know, it's like, what is the story and what is it that you're getting at? There's a film of ours where the filmmaker is the central character called Unbroken Glass. And it's a filmmaker trying to understand where his family come from, what happened to his parents because they both died when he was very young. And it's about trauma and, you know, and also family. And I think it's a good example where the filmmaker is in a great deal of the film, almost all of it. He's on camera a lot. And it's very much his and his family's story. But I don't think it crosses that line into becoming self-indulgent.
This is our last question? Or we have one more question? That was our last question. Okay, thank you. Does that mean we're done? Oh, this is so fun. Wouldn't you like to just have it keep going? Gordon, you've been fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, we have more time.
Okay.
Oh, I'm so confused. Okay, now it's time for the skateboarding stories.
It's like in football where they reset the clock.
Oh, I think we just got some overtime or something.
7 seconds.
One of the things I just wanted to bring up, and I'm familiar with the film that he's referring to, and taking on a personal story, and I just think that it's a journey. I'm just going to say that it's a journey, and I think where you start with it isn't always where you're going to end up with it, and you have to, this is something we were talking about and I wanted to ask you about, just advice for filmmakers, because it's a long period of time, and I know the arc from being a documentary editor for a long time. I know about right here is when everyone wants to give up. You're just past midway, right? You've been doing some editing, you see some scenes that actually are starting to make some sense, but the film doesn't make any sense, right? And you really want to give up. And so I think it would be wonderful, because you have shepherded so many films, including your own, getting over that hump, getting to the place where you finish it. Talk a little bit about, what kind of advice you can give to young filmmakers to hang in there, what that point means in the story, and what kind of things they can be thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, you described it very well, really. It's just knowing that it's almost always happens that you struggle and you're dealing with the fundamental contradictions that the film is about, and it feels like Sisyphus, you're pushing the rock up the hill and it keeps rolling down on you, and we realize things aren't going to work and this is a mistake and that kind of thing. But there is that point where you've just gotten it over the hill, and it's going to be a lot easier now because the arc of the story has become clearer. You just have to know have faith and keep struggling with it. I mean, editing documentaries is very much, I don't know if one could ever make a movie about it, because I think it would be,
No.
but it is a struggle. It's coming to terms, and that's kind of what I like about documentary, and editing is at the heart of that, which is you're in a world, you're in a culture, you're trying to make sense of something, and you're looking for the story. It's very different from most feature films, not all, but most feature films. There's a script, and you're telling a story that came out, it's already written.
Right.
Documentaries are not written. The writing takes place in the editing room. The story comes out of that process, that struggle that you're describing.
And, one of the things that I tell students and the people that I've worked with on their films, you have to be very adamant about your ideas, and then you also have to be willing to let them go. So can you talk a little bit about that as well? Does that resonate with you, what I'm saying? So, just that idea of, absolutely, this is the way I want it to be, until you hear something that tells you, it's not working. It's time to take it out.
Right. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I remember I can't even remember, was it something that was done in connection with some of Judy Hoffman's students or something, and they were showing us a cut. We had some involvement with it, and Jerry was being very harsh about a particular character in the film and thought that he should go away. And the person who was kind of responsible for it said a few things, and then they sort of folded their deck. And I was like, no, you're not going to understand. What's at the heart of what we're talking about is the dialectical relationship. It's these two forces coming, and that's why film, often is very collaborative. People work together, and it's those arguments, it's those battles that then sometimes result in a whole new way of seeing something. And, I was on a shoot, something I'm working on last week, and we've been dealing with a major problem in this film about how we're going to tell the story, and we knew it was out there, but we didn't have a solution. Leslie and I are co-directing it, and we talked about it a lot. And we're interviewing Howard, and the intern who'd come on the shoot with us to help us said, why don't you ask him about how he feels about Norman's playing? Why does he like Norman's playing so much? And it was like, that's the question. And in answering that question, Howard, who's one of the producers of the film, we may not even use this interview in it, but it was like, yes, that's the solution to how we're going to deal with his playing and how it makes you feel, and why Howard thinks it's so great, even though he's not the greatest pianist in the world. And it was like a huge breakthrough to something we'd been struggling with from the beginning of this project, that, somebody just brought up a question. It was like,
And I also think there are the things that you film and the things that you edit that don't become the final film, but are what get you to the final film. And I think you have to be willing to film those scenes, have those shoot days, do those edits, and then sort of jettison that, because it was what like you just said, it gave you that breakthrough. It's not the film, but it's the It's the idea that you needed to get to the film, right?
Yeah, I mean, in Hollywood, they call it you have to kill your babies.
Right,
you know?
right.
And I've told you that's in the past. That's why I really stopped editing years ago. I used to earn my living as an editor, which was fine. But as I started shooting more and directing our own films, and particularly shooting, I can't edit my own footage. If I've got a great shot with a perfect rack zoom boom, I will go to the ends of the earth to make that work within the I'm bending the story out of shape to preserve my shot.
Right.
And when Jerry started editing our films, he was like nothing better than to destroy one of my shots.
Right. That's a whole nother story. But I also think that, again, this is probably another conversation, that trust that develops between the editor and the director, that at some point when the editor says to you, it's got to go, you've built enough of a relationship that you can hear it, as opposed to, because if somebody says it to you 2 weeks into editing, you're like, you got to go. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Hey, it says end of show.
Yeah.
So it's the end of the show. This was great. Thank you all. So I just want to remind you again, tomorrow we have fabulous master classes. Meet us at the skateboard park, Grand Park Skateboard Park. Bing is going to be there. We're going to be doing filming, so bring your skateboards, bring your cameras, and make sure you sign a release so if you get hurt, it's not our problem. And then in the afternoon, we have fabulous sound experts. We have Zack Piper and Shuling Young, and they're going to be talking about all their experiences. They're also filmmakers and producers, and they do production sound, so that should be fabulous as well. Thank you so much, Gordon Quinn, and thank you to Bing Liu and Minding the Gap.
Thank you, guys.